Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Robbie Campbell, Projects Chair here at Principles First. Today, our Metro New York City chapter is proud to bring you Congress at a Crossroads, exploring ideas on representation and reform. Thank you all for joining us today. As many of you know, Principles First is a national grassroots movement of people who share a love of democracy and concern for our country. We are not politicians. We are not lobbyists. We are volunteers, patriotic citizens just like you, who realize that if leaders aren't coming to save us, then we have to be the leaders. We hope you'll join us. To today's topic. When we discuss political leadership, the conversation usually centers around the president and the executive branch. But that's not how our system was designed. It's supposed to be a tripartite system built around checks and balances. So if, like today, one branch has accumulated too much power, it's because another has failed to fully exercise theirs. That's why today's town hall is specifically focused on congressional reform, because a stronger legislative branch is essential to ensuring the executive remains accountable. We're fortunate to have three panelists today who have spent years thinking about this from different perspectives. Christianna Rodriguez is a policy strategist and constitutional defense advocate at Issue 1. She works in advancing reforms that restore Congress's authority under Article 1 of the Constitution. Gregg Nunziata is an attorney and executive director of the Society for the Rule of Law. He previously served as the chief nominations counsel for the Senate Judiciary Committee, as well as policy counsel to the Senate Republican Policy Committee. Finally, Jeff Mayhugh is the project of Project No Cap, a national grassroots organization dedicated to uncapping the House of Representatives, which would strengthen representation and bring members of Congress closer to the people they serve. All three panelists bring thoughtful ideas on how Congress can better fulfill its role and strengthen representative government. We are extremely grateful to have them. One quick housekeeping note, there will be time for Q&A at the end, so if you have a question, click the Q&A icon on the bottom to submit yours, and we'll get to as many as we can. And with that, I'll turn it over to our moderator for today's discussion, Rory Topping. Rory, take it away.
All right. Hello, everybody. I just want to reiterate a thank you on behalf of Principles First. I am on their New York City Metro chapter, and this is a topic that I know I care deeply about, as I feel like all of our attendees do, not just as an engaged citizen, but as a former congressional staffer and somebody who's very interested in the ills of partisan gerrymandering. I have to put in my plug. I have a book coming out on partisan gerrymandering in September. I hope you all check it out, but we are going to get right to our panel today. And since the topic of our conversation is congressional reform, I'd like each of our panelists to chime in with what first convinced you that Congress was in need of structural reform rather than simply electing different people. I think, Christianna, can we start with you? And then we'll go Greg, Jeff. I'd just like to hear from all of you on that question.
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me to this, Rory. So I think that's really the challenge that Congress faces today. Every election, we tell ourselves that if we elect different people, Washington will work better. But I think some of the same problems keep coming up, and that's because so many of our problems are structural. Congress has slowly given away so much of its constitutional authority, and it's lost a lot of its institutional capacity. I think too often members are forced to react to crises instead of doing the hard work that it takes to legislate. And I think that's why constitutional reform matters. If we want better policy, we need a Congress that's actually built to succeed. And that's one that's capable of carrying out the responsibilities that the framers intentionally placed in Article 1 of the Constitution.
Greg?
Yeah, I think that it's a good place to start that the founders put this in Article 1. This is meant to be the most important of the three branches of government, and it is completely absent. And you can't overstate what a crisis that is for our democracy. We, the people, are most present in Congress. And when Congress is not playing its constitutional role in our democracy, the people aren't. I mean, we are taking the demos, the people, out of democracy by sidelining Congress, and it's a crisis in representation. It's also a crisis in our liberties. The founders devised three branches of government to check each other so that we are not abused by government power. And when Congress isn't doing its job, the president overreaches, the courts are overburdened, we are all vulnerable. So yes, I think we need to do a lot of things. One, we should be thinking about civics so that American people and American voters understand what they're voting for, and maybe we will choose more of the right kinds of people. But I agree that that is likely not enough, and we need to think about ways we could change incentives to empower congressmen and congresswomen to do their jobs effectively and powerfully, to make the job something they want to do. The hard work that Christianna referred to is hard work. So it needs to be rewarded. We need to find ways to make that rewarding. And some of that is through education and of like we're doing today, but I think other structural approaches, as you referred to, and there can be a range of them, from how we run our elections to the size of the House, to the internal rules of the House, to its to and Senate, and to their capacity, that can really make a difference in starting to shift incentives and encouraging the kind of behavior we want to see in members.
Right. And Jeff?
Yeah, so I think I come at this maybe from a little bit differently. I'm not from academia or politics at all. I got involved because I watched the wrong people get elected to office over and over again as a voter. And I just, if I'm being a little bit honest, I was a little afraid, 2016, 2020. And then COVID hit, and I just kind of started reading. I wanted to understand what was going on because I felt so lost. And I started reading our history, and you talked about how Congress has slowly given away power, and that's kind of the problem why the executive have much. I read it in a linear line, right? Starting at the beginning all the way through, through the 1800s and 1900s, and you can kind of see. And so, like, I discovered the structural problem, through my initial research of learning about politics. And so that's really been my focus since I got into it. I now understand. I probably didn't when I first got into politics, but I now understand how important representation is and what it actually means. When I first got in, I just thought, like, these people should do their job, right? Like, not really understanding what their job was. And it takes some time. And I think that's kind of how a lot of voters out there feel, is they just feel like things are broken. They're not sure why they're broken. And as we're going to talk about today, it really is the structural issue that creates the negative incentives to create bad leaders.
Thank you. And all of you made references to history in your answer to that first question. So I'd like to focus on our nation's history for our next question, because I think that that really informs the conversation that we're having today. So Christianna, you're part of the Article 1 initiative at Issue 1. We talked about the fact that number one is so important here. There's a reason that the framers put Congress first when they were drafting the Constitution. Can you expand a little bit on, you mentioned Congress has given some authority away. What are the authorities that it has, and why have they been so reluctant to exercise some of that authority lately?
So first, I think when the framers put Congress first, when they put them in Article 1, they were making a statement. I don't think it was an accident. Just as Gregg alluded to, they're almost designed to be the most powerful branch, the most dominant, because they're the closest to the people, and they're responding to what the people want. Some of the powers that we see that most recently they've given away or not acted on or kind of stepped back from. Congress decides when we go to war. It controls the power of the purse. That's how taxpayer dollars are spent. It regulates commerce. That includes trade and a new word in people's vocabularies as of late, tariffs. And as Jeff alluded to, over time, presidents have exercised more and more power and more discretion, and Congress hasn't done anything about it. Some of it happened because they delegated their authority, and the other reason I truly think is because Congress stopped insisting on exercising the powers it already had. So those of us who went to law school understand that if neither branch is acting or is speaking on something. It's the one who's acting that gets to make the rules, and I think that's what we're seeing currently. A lot of people assume when issue one is working on congressional reform that we're trying to make Congress more powerful, and that's not the case. We're just trying to make Congress constitutional again, just like the framers wanted them to be. We want Congress to use the powers that it actually has. Our Constitution had was designed with checks and balances for a reason, and it works when each branch is doing its job instead of expecting another branch to do it for them. One way I like to think about it is like if every branch has a mission, um, one part can try to do someone else's job for a short amount of time, but eventually the whole operation becomes ineffective. And our constitutional system works the same way. We just need to bring them back to being a strong, true co-equal branch.
I'm going to go to Gregg next. The Society for the Rule of Law often emphasizes the importance of Congress as a co-equal branch of government. From your perspective, how has Congress drifted away from the framers' vision for having co-equal branches of government?
So I'm gonna be annoyingly pedantic for a second, but so we use the word all the time, co-equal, and I guess we know what that means. But the framers didn't use that word. The word co-equal actually first started creeping into our conversation about this in the 20th century, and it was usually used by people who favored a much stronger presidency. The founders in the Federalist Papers, they only used the word co-equal to talk about the relationships between the states, not the branches of government. And I think it's fair to say that they envision the branches to be maybe equal in dignity and authority, but not really equal in purpose. I mean, Congress is meant to represent the people, which is a higher role, I think, of the three, and it's meant to settle our national debates and our discourse and to set policy. If you were a stranger to this country, if you were a Martian who came down from space and read the Constitution, you would think, gosh, if I want to control this country, I got to be in Congress. I mean, that is where the decisions are made. All the president's doing is executing laws. He's doing what Congress tells him to do. The power's in Congress, and that's clearly not where we are today. And it's just a tremendous problem. I mean, even look at now we're getting into campaign season, and you see people running for Congress and Senate saying, I'm going to go to Washington to advance President Trump's agenda or to stop President Trump's agenda. That's completely backwards. I mean, this is going to Congress to represent us, to set an agenda, to settle national policy decisions. But people are actually like campaigning for Congress to be lieutenants to the president, and that is just deeply misunderstanding our system, and it causes all sorts of dysfunction. So it's a problem. It's been a problem that has kind of gotten worse, I think, especially in the 20th century, after the Second World War and after the Cold War, where people were worried about a lot of foreign threats and just started giving power to the president. And now we're in a place where I think the incentives are bad in all sorts of ways. I worked for Senator Rubio when he was running for president in 2016, and I remember campaigning with him and hearing voters just furious that he had ever sat down in a room with people like Chuck Schumer and tried to work on legislation. And he wanted to say to these voters, don't you understand what the job of a member of Congress is? It is to work on legislation, which requires working with people of the other party. And some of that, and we can get into this other. I think a lot of that has to do with the way we've structured our primary systems and all sorts of kind of misunderstandings that voters have about what a congressman or a senator should be doing. But we are miles away from the design of the Constitution, and we're all suffering from it.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned the Federalist Papers, because that is a great layup for Jeff, who I know loves history, and CAP is their arguments are very deeply rooted in history. So, Jeff, you mentioned you've done a lot of reading about how the framers envisioned representation and what it should look like. Can you elaborate on the differences between how representation was designed in our constitutional system versus what it looks like today?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, it's obviously it's actually expanded in a lot of ways. There are more people have the ability to vote now than they did when the Constitution was originally written, and that's a really good thing. However, that vote, that power of that vote has been diluted by the House being capped. And again, coming at this from a different perspective with like a fresh pair of eyes, it's kind of easy to see what the problem is. Is we talk about democracy a lot, and democracy is really important, but in our country, our democracy is held in our representation. And if you read any book on the Constitutional Convention, one of the words that you're going to hear a lot is the word representation. If you, in the Declaration of Independence, they cite a right of representation that is, uh, restricted by King George, right? And that's very much like the issue that we're facing now. A lot of those gripes are very similar to the gripes that people have now. It was against the king, and now it's against, I guess, ourselves, because, like we've mentioned, we've abdicated that power. Um, it's funny you mentioned it was mentioned just a minute ago about how like the one that acts is the one that kind of has control. I think Thomas Reed would really appreciate that. But that's also kind of part of the problem is we do have this checks and balances system, and when one institution maybe acts out of line, another institution rises up to check it. Teddy Roosevelt called this big must check big, right? He kind of expanded the role of the federal government to check corporations, but a lot of that power made its way into the executive branch, and it really should be in Congress. And ultimately, that's what we're facing now. Is we're just out of balance. We just need to expand the people's role, allow them a chance to be part of the process again. And I think, anybody that follows our project, Project No Cap, they know this story. And how important was representation? Well, George Washington was overseeing the Constitutional Convention, and he was very quiet. He felt himself, kind of an overseer. Not he shouldn't put his thumb on the scale at all. But when it came to the size of the congressional districts, this is the only time that George Washington stood up to speak, and he spoke in favor of a smaller representation ratio, a smaller district. Therefore, people could make it and meet their representative. They were talking about, well, how long is it going to take to get from here to here? How many people are in each district? And how is a single representative going to actually hear those voices? And so he spoke in favor of a 1 for 30,000 ratio instead of a larger ratio. And I think, how important was it to the founders? They created this very important representative democracy based on this idea. And so it was very important.
Thanks. We're going to take our conversation from the past and we're going to fast forward now to the present. So I'm going to go back to Christianna. A lot of your work at Issue 1 specifically focuses on congressional modernization. And when people hear modernization, a lot of times they think that means technology, things of that nature, but it involves much more than that. Again, we've talked about you are focused on structural reform, committees, staffing, capacity. What are some of the less visible reforms that you would like people to be aware of that can help with congressional modernization?
So I do think that you hit the nail on the head, Rory, when you said capacity. Um, Congress is trying to oversee one of the most complex organizations in the world, the federal government. But as we're starting to see, especially those of us who look closely, the staff, the expertise, the institutional support, all of that is atrophying or leaving or finding different places to go, especially when it feels like there's nothing that they can do. And I truly think that it's that expertise that needs to come back to Congress. It's the people who understand what's happening that need to staff those elected officials. Because when Congress lacks capacity, it becomes more dependent on the executive branch for information and expertise. And that's backwards. The branch responsible for oversight shouldn't have to rely on the branch it's supposed to oversee. So I truly do think it means investing in staff, improving committee operations. A lot of the different hearings and stuff that we see have developed into kangaroo courts, preserving that institutional knowledge and making oversight more effective and not just the check in the box. Um, and then mostly, if you don't create an environment in Congress where people want to stay and build careers, then that means you're losing people. And then I'll end with like, um, while there are two main parties, we are doing a terrible job of fostering collaboration and civility, because Congress is supposed to function as an institution and not a crisis response operation. And there was a statistic that I read recently, that said that Congress hasn't modernized since the invention of email. Um, and as we do look at technology and how it's changed, and to see that Congress hasn't changed and they haven't adapted to the 21st century, I think we really need to take a better look at the people, the tools, and the capacity that Congress has to fulfill their constitutional responsibilities that we're asking it to carry out. You're muted, Roy.
Sorry. I was going to say, Greg, a lot of our national dialogue focuses on what the president is doing. A lot of your work specifically focuses on the judiciary and what the judiciary is doing. Do you find that because Congress has failed to live up to its constitutional duties, that there's an expectation people have now that the other two branches will do the work that Congress was designed to handle?
Oh no, that's absolutely true. I mean, I think uh, so many of our national disputes end up in the courts, at the Supreme Court. They're often get to the Supreme Court because the president tried to do something by executive order, because Congress wasn't acting, and then everybody on the left and the right gets all worked up and outraged when the court rules the way they would not like it to rule, whatever direction that is. And it's just this incredible sense of powerlessness that people have, when our disputes are being settled by a president trying to force something through on his own initiative, and then the court deciding whether that he had the power or not. I mean, just one example that just came to my mind is, student loan forgiveness. I mean, this is something that Congress could legislate about, and we could decide what the rules would be. But instead, you had President Biden just trying lots of different ways to forgive student loans, and things not going his way in the court, and people were angry on both sides at various points in this. But it's just like our national legislative body was just not at the table for all this. Same thing with, I mean, immigration policy is all presidential action, and the courts ruling whether it's lawful or not. And it's just a whole range of issues that frankly divide us as a country, get us really upset as a country because we're trying to resolve them through tools and through components of the federal government that weren't designed to do that. Congress is designed to do that, to force us to come to some kind of accommodation. And I think in a lot of these issues, the couple I mentioned, but many, many more, if something actually went through Congress and Congress was forced to have meaningful conversations and compromises, we would be in a much less divided and much more stable place as a country, kind of as a people, and then across a range of policy issues. But yeah, the courts should not be settling our most significant national policy disputes, and every national policy dispute we have shouldn't be driven by a president. Think about how nasty and existential our presidential elections are every 4 years. That's in part because we are effectively turning over policymaking to one person. It's this binary choice, and it shouldn't be that. We should have, 535 people or 1,535 people, Jeff. I'm not sure the appropriate number, but we should have a large number of people working through these problems and finding this kind of range of settlement, which is not going to be, the maximalist vision of a Republican or a Democrat on any issue. It'll be somewhere in between, and I mean, that was how the system was designed to work, and it's not happening on virtually all of the most important policy issues we have as a people, and it's a real problem, and it's causing people. I said the dislike for Congress and having taken Congress out of it is spilling over. People are angry at the president, and they're angry at the courts, because they're not designed to resolve these problems. And so I mean, and I think this is we need to understand. I kind of said this at the beginning again, but we really need to see ourselves in Congress, and maybe other modes of representation or election will help us do that, because we've had this sort of for generations, kind of both on the left and the right, but I'm a conservative Republican, and I think my party and my people are very guilty of this. We've got mad at government and derided Congress, but Congress is us, and we need to understand that. We spent when Republicans first took over Congress in the 1990s, after decades, they cut a lot of staffing budgets, they cut technology budgets and expert budgets, and Christianna was excellent on this. I mean, those kinds of resources matter for Congress to do its job, and in sort of this anger at government, we've punished ourselves, and in fact, made government stronger and less responsive as a result. So this is a really important conversation. So sorry, I can go on forever, but thank you.
When I structured the questions, I just decided to do it alphabetically. So I kind of went Christianna, Gregg, Jeff. But this is like working out wonderful because Christianna like teed up that answer for Gregg. And Gregg, you just teed up this next question for Jeff. So I'm glad that that's worked out. Thank you, Alphabet. But Jeff, I want to turn to the topic of representation. One argument you make for expanding the House is that it's not just about having more members in the House of Representatives, it's that it would change incentives. Can you explain to people who are maybe less familiar with this issue what some of those incentives are? How could more representation influence things like constituent services, campaign finance, and even redistricting?
Yeah, so and I think this goes into what Christiana was saying when she was talking about it's just such a large logistical problem to solve any of these things. And this goes back to the argument that, well, it wasn't really an argument. They weren't really talking to each other, but Madison and Montesquieu had about a small republic versus a large republic. And, Madison said, extend the sphere. And when he says extend the sphere, what he's extending the sphere of power to more people in the country. It's self-government. It's a lot of responsibility. I think that's the thing that we miss. We talk about the power, but we don't talk about the responsibility. And self-government is about responsibility, not power. And I started homeschooling my daughters recently, and we were doing multiplication, right? And we moved from doing single digit multiplication to for double digit multiplication. And my daughter was really struggling with this. And I said, honey, it's really easy. It's the same that you were doing here. You just make it smaller, right? You look at it's a big number and you break it down individually between these two numbers. And it's kind of the same way that we need to look at what we're dealing with here is the fact that we've got this really big logistical problem, and everybody in Congress is focused, the incentives focus you towards power, but they don't focus you towards responsibility. By extending the sphere of power, breaking the districts and making them smaller, you shift that incentive towards responsibility, and you make that logistical problem that we're dealing with easier. Okay, you bring the people back into the room. That's what I like to tell people all the time is the American people, the regular everyday citizen is checked out. They're tired of the fighting and they're frustrated that nothing gets done. And to the point that Gregg was talking about is about us and them. Yuval Levin writes about this all the time. It's Congress is not us or them, it's we, all of us, right? Like it's our job. It's our responsibility. We can point the finger at everybody else, but at the end of the day, we, and I include myself in this, has voted very poorly in my life. I have not been engaged the way that I should have been engaged. I didn't do the research that I should have done. I watched social media, I watched the news, and I reacted emotionally instead of thinking about what I was actually doing. And that's my fault. And instead of being mad at everybody else for the system being broken, I just like, okay, well, what can I do to help? And how can we start to solve this problem? And so shifting that incentive so it's about responsibility gets these congressional representatives off of mainstream media. Okay, because if there's 835 of them or 800 and whatever, 70, 1,000, it's going to be harder for the big networks to carry them. They're going to be less incentivized to try to go there to get attention from their district and actually go to their district and meet with the people and hear what they're saying. And I think the most important thing about that is when you get the representatives in their district meeting with the average people, they'll actually feel more confident to check the executive branch. Because right now, they're so dependent on fundraising and the party apparatus to keep their job, and they have to run for re-election every 2 years. So they're hesitant to stand up on something maybe they believe in because they're disconnected from the people they serve. And so they don't know if those people have their back or not. By making that relationship closer, they'll understand that the people will have their back. They'll be willing to stand up and do the principled thing.
Thank you. On the topic of today's political environment, all of you alluded to partisanship. That's a big part of the conversation today. Christianna, you have worked in the military, which is a traditionally nonpartisan environment. There's some arguments that the current administration, their leadership has maybe tried to change that. You've also worked in state government, which is really important. And sometimes there are greater incentives in our state government to reach across the aisle to work on local issues. Are there any reform ideas that you think Republicans and Democrats agree on more than the public realizes that can give us some hope? And I just want to add to that, there was a big primary election. People focused on the ideas rather than the labels.
Yeah, so I've got so much to respond to here. And I think I want to start with the fact that like I'm still serving in the United States Marine Corps just as a reservist now instead of an active duty member. And one thing that I'm proud of as I continue to serve is the military isn't designed to serve a political party. Every Marine, every soldier, every sailor, every airman, every guardian, every Coast Guardman takes an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And that oath doesn't change every 4 years. Members of Congress take that same oath. And I think that's something we don't remind ourselves of enough. Our constitutional system only works if our loyalty is first to the Constitution and the institutions it creates. Sorry. So I will step off of that soapbox. But I'm optimistic about congressional reform because there's so much that people agree on because we're people. Like we can't nest ourselves in the labels of Democrat, Republican, whatever. And as you alluded to, I worked in the Massachusetts State Senate up until January of this past year. And two of the laws that I am like most proud of working on started as bipartisan from the beginning. In fact, the first one I want to talk about started from conservative Republican. And I know people will say Massachusetts, there aren't any conservatives there, but it started in this particular senator's office, and he saw this archaic law in the books that prevented non-citizens from receiving liquor licenses. And both members of both parties were like, yeah, that's unconstitutional and it's kind of archaic. We understand why it was put on the books so many years ago, but they both sides wanted to show that we as a state have moved past this exclusionary stuff and we know what our Constitution says and we're going to stick to that. The other one that I'm super proud of is, as we all know, we're probably slightly affected by, was the government shutdown. The law that the senator I was working for and I drafted up, because she's also a service member, was something to protect federal workers and service members from evictions during a government shutdown. Both parties agreed that people shouldn't suffer financially because Washington couldn't do his job or come to an agreement. And I think that's a main thing that we're thinking about when we look at it at the congressional level. Like, what are we doing to protect people? Some of the stuff we're working on at issue 1 today is banning insider trading, strengthening support for election officials, improving how Congress itself functions. And there are members on both sides of the aisle who genuinely want to make our institutions stronger. And even though those conversations don't make headlines, they happen every day. And I think that's something worth building on.
Thank you. And, as a Massachusetts native, I appreciate your comments about the state because as a former Republican Hill staffer, when I would tell people I was from Massachusetts, they'd be like, what? And so my running joke used to be that when I registered to vote, they made me move, and that's how I ended up in DC. So anyway, I appreciate the joke about Massachusetts, but Greg, one challenge with institutional reform is that it often requires elected officials to change the very rules that got them elected. So speaking of being a Hill staffer, you were a senior Senate staffer. You had several different positions there. Based on that experience, can you talk a little bit about how you build momentum for reforms and ideas that don't obviously benefit one party at the expense of another? And how do we encourage members to keep doing that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a key problem here, and you're right to raise it. It certainly makes it challenging, although everything's challenging in Washington these days. And I guess I'd like to echo a few things that both you and Christiana had already said. One, I mean, I grew up a Republican in Connecticut, which isn't much easier than Massachusetts. Two,
Brooklyn's in the house. All right.
New England Republicans, we exist. So but there is, as I mean, as Christiana said, there's cross ideological interest in this. There are members from kind of the furthest left of the Democratic Party and the furthest right of the Republican Party in Congress who think this is a problem and want to fix it. Outside of Congress, when you kind of talk to think tanks and experts, again, broad interest from the furthest left progressive groups to really conservative, even kind of MAGA oriented think tanks and groups. People realize there's a problem here, and that's encouraging. I mean, they don't have all the same diagnoses of what how we got here, or what the exact problem is, or how to fix it. But that there's broad kind of cross ideological consensus that this is a problem is something that's promising. And some work has been done. It's not been the big changes, the sexiest things, but the House had the Select Committee on Modernization, which did some meaningful work on improving how the House functions. It was low-hanging fruit and baby steps, but that's how you get to walking with baby steps. Um, when we're trying to change the rules that might affect members, and I think there's a couple of things to think about. One. I guess broadly, just historically, get people angry. When people are angry around the country, Congress can respond. Christiana mentioned their work on insider trading by congressmen. There's a real movement around that because people are outraged, and if people can really unify around some of these ideas, I think you have some prospect of real reform. And remember, we've had a lot of reforms over the last 100, 200 years. Some of them have been good, as Jeff mentioned, expanding the franchise. Some of them have been less good, or at least are contested about whether they were good ideas. The primary system, going to single member districts for Congress, all sorts of changes to the filibuster. All these things have come about often through kind of broad pressure from the American people who wanted things to work differently. Something else I think when we think about reforming Congress and reforming any institutions around elections or how Congress works is the job kind of sucks, right? I mean, like the members aren't happy. People are quitting all the time because they don't feel like they're making a difference. They find their days exhausting. A lot of their days are spent dialing for dollars, or it's felt, it's just if they're just showing up and filing a party line vote, that doesn't feel empowering. Maybe this isn't the way that we think of. We want to think about Congress, but we should. We should think about how we want to make the job suck less. Like think about reforms that a member can get excited about. Like, well, this is going to make my job better. This is going to make me more powerful. And there's lots of different ways we can think about what those reforms are. Again, they could be about how Congress works or about how campaigns and elections work. But I would always have that in mind because you can get Congress to do stuff that it doesn't want to do when the people are angry. But if you can find ways that Congress actually kind of does want to do it, you're going to amplify your ability to move Congress. If you're putting wind in sails that in a direction that they want to go, or part of them at least wants to go. The other kind of small thing to always keep in mind is with a lot of these kinds of reforms, you can think about delayed effective dates, so you don't know who's going to benefit from them. One of the things I did in Congress was work on judicial nominations and judicial selections, and basically every time we successfully expand the number of federal judgeships, we do it with a delayed date so that the next president will get to fill the vacancies. And just by putting that in there, so nobody really like we know we need more judges. We're not going to create new judges now because Trump's going to get to fill those judgeships. Well, these judgeships will be created and the seats will open in 2 or 5 years when nobody knows who's going to control the Senate and who's going to control the White House. So there's lots of these reforms we can think about making them kick in after an election or two, so people can't see exactly how the politics will play out around it.
Thanks. I've actually heard that come up in the context of redistricting reform as well. That's another area where people see it benefiting one party at the expense of another. But if we do it, 5 years down the road, we don't know who's going to control Congress, governorships. And so I think that's a really good point. I'm glad that you brought that up. Jeff, turning to you, expanding the House occasionally gets labeled as either a progressive or a conservative issue. Historically, however, there is support across the ideological spectrum. Why do you think that this issue in particular defies traditional partisan categories? And how do we help people realize that about not only this issue, but other issues as well?
Yeah, I think it's a progressive reform because it's a big change that people aren't used to, right? It's been capped since 1929. Nobody alive today knows what it was like to reapportion the House and make it larger. And it's a conservative reform because it's the original design of the House of Representatives. So you kind of blend those two things. And if you look across the political spectrum, I've got these books here. So Patrick Deneen, who's, we may not be a fan of, but he supports uncapping the House of Representatives. Yuval Levin, obviously, I'm a big fan of his. He supports uncapping the House of Representatives. Osita Nuevu also supports uncapping the House. I can go down the line. Lee Drutman, Danielle Allen. Everywhere you look, people support this idea because it benefits everyone. Progressive, conservative, doesn't matter what you believe or who you vote for. It gives you, the average citizen, more representation in your government, and that's the thing you need to make it work properly. And Christianna was talking about other reforms, and I think that other reforms are, important and necessary. And Yuval has said that uncapping the House or expanding the number of representatives makes other reforms politically possible. It's back to that thing I was teaching my daughter about make a big problem small. When you make a big problem small, you're actually able to get more done. You look at that piece of paper with 20 multiplication questions on it and you get like anxious and whatever, and you're like, well, you only have to do one at a time, and then it's like a little bit easier. And it's the same concept. And then, to Gregg's point about, anger and emotion. And I think he's right. It does spark something in people to get things done, but I think it's important for leaders to understand that they can't just feed the anger. They have to turn that anger into productivity. Think about it in your own personal life. Okay, if you're really frustrated or something, like what do you do? Like you're either going to explode at somebody or like I do, I maybe go to my garage and I start working on a project, or I go to the basketball court and I start, shooting hoop. Before I got my hip replaced, I would go running. That was my thing to like release my frustration, was to go running. It was something to do. It distracted me from my problem. I was able to think about it more coherently as I, unwind it a little bit. And I did something productive that helped myself, right? And that's what we need to do. We need to turn this emotion, this negative emotion, into positive productivity to get this type of stuff done.
Thanks. And, one of the things that we hear most from our volunteers and our members, no matter where in the country they live, is the simple question, what can I do? So I would like to ask each of you, how would you answer that question? And do your respective organizations have any calls to action that you'd like to share today? We'll start with Christianna.
I love what Jeff said about making a big a big problem small. But I'll start with your first question, because I get that same question a lot just from the different people that I interact with that aren't part of the political system. And they're like, I'm one person, what can I really do? And my answer is always the same. Like, you have a lot more influence than you think. And even though Congress feels really, really far away, as both Jeff and Greg alluded to, they were never supposed to be. Um, so one of the things I love about issue one is we're constantly looking for ways to help everyday Americans engage with democracy in meaningful ways. Sometimes that's advocating for institutional reforms, but a lot of time it's the smaller things like becoming a poll worker, writing a public comment, supporting your local election officials. People don't realize how the small becomes big so quickly. Meet with your member of Congress when they're back in the district, organize people in your community. Even when you don't agree with uh, people on everything, you can still advocate for reforms together. And I think people underestimate how much elected officials want to hear from thoughtful and engaged constituents. Um, Again, they may not always agree with you, but if they're hearing from you, I think it matters more. You're the voter. You're the person who puts them in office. So your concerns should be their concerns. Um, and the couple things that I specifically that issue one is working on are sorry, and I've got some links that I can share. Joining civic groups, and we've also got election protection toolkit that we can drop in the chat later if that's something that people want to see. But really joining civic circles, um, that's a great way to just get involved, understand what other people are talking about. Like Jeff was saying, democracy isn't asking all of us to do everything. It's asking each of us to do something. Um, a, a senator I once worked for got this question, and they asked her, well, when you hit a roadblock, how do you know like to keep going? Like what do you do? And she was like, I've got so many issues to work on. Like I just put this one on pause and go on to the next one. And I think like us as citizens can do a lot to work. You don't have to work on all the reforms at the same time. You can hop back and forth from the things that you care about. So that would be my advice, and I'll send the links to Carolyn so that she can send them out to the audience.
Thank you. And Greg, how would you answer that question?
Yeah, oh gosh. I mean, I would echo most of what Christiana said. Of course, I would say what you should do is you go to the Society for the Rule of Law.org and become a member. I should say that first. We are a membership organization, and I would appreciate more members. We have a statement of principles there that people can sign without becoming a member, which has thousands of signatures now, which we're really proud of and has, I think, made a big difference. It was actually recently also adopted by the American Bar Association, our statement of principles about the importance of the rule of law and our institutions. But I agree that we ought to start local. You can make a big difference in your community, and I think it's first of all, it's just helpful for your soul. Like you'll feel good about yourself if you get involved in your community and things that matter to you. But I think it also gradually begins to change the culture in ways that matter. I mean, it does really have a snowball effect, and I would kind of always encourage people who want to be involved in making our country work better to, although we're talking about Congress right now, and I'm mostly talking and working on federal issues, for most people, starting locally is really the place that have the biggest impact, and it really does build up. And yes, write your congressman, call your congressman. They do respond to those kinds of pressures. Also, letters to the editor for the newspapers that still exist. Like all of these kinds of ways you can get involved that are really pretty simple, but do make a difference. Christiana talked about civic circles. I think that's also something that we don't join things enough as Americans, which we used to do, and that's been a great historical strength of our democracy. Has anyone talked about Tocqueville yet? I know we've talked about Montesquieu, but maybe not Tocqueville yet. But it's been a big force of our democracy, and it still is. I think that you think about joining a veterans group or a faith group or a community group or whatever it might be, that's not even expressly political, but you will have moments where your concerns, the concerns of your group intersect with public policy. And I think those kinds of groups, particularly groups that aren't expressly political, can have a really powerful voice on Washington and have kind of over the course of our history that kind of groups of, again, veterans or faith groups or groups of any kind of particular associative nature really have a huge additional boost in their voice when they do engage with the political process. So start local, join things, don't give up.
All right. And Jeff, how would you answer that question?
Well, I would direct you to www.projectnocap.com. There you can email your representative directly from our website with a form letter about uncapping the House. We do encourage you to personalize it. Add something in there that you'd like, or maybe something else you want to see with your Congress representative. And you can volunteer. You can, like Greg was talking about, is you join a group, and we're putting together groups all across the country. We've got a volunteer grassroots organization. We're starting a canvassing outreach program, and we're also a membership program. So you can donate. If you donate $99 annually per year, you become a member, and join the organization to turn that negative emotion into positive productivity. That's really what we're trying to do. We recognize we're a big tent. Like, you only have to believe in one thing to be part of our organization, and that is representation, and that you deserve a right of representation, which is what I believe our founders intended when they wrote our Constitution. So yeah, and then I think the other thing that you could do is you can buy a Y435 t-shirt. We're a 100% volunteer organization. I donate all the t-shirts to the organization myself. So all of those proceeds go to help the organization spread the word. And the most important thing that a Y435 t-shirt does is it helps you talk to other people in your community without having that awkward conversation where instead of you having to go out and engage somebody on politics, what you'll find is people will come to you and they will ask you, all right, what is Y435? It opens the door, and what you'll find is people love to hear it. They have been frustrated. They have seen the bad incentives. They've seen the bad people elected to office. And when they hear about this structural problem, it just makes sense. And they want to get involved too. So go to projectnocap.com and get involved.
Thank you. Now, we want to end on a little bit of a fun note before we get to our audience question and answers. So, Christianna, my question to you is there one congressional reform that you think people aren't talking about enough, and one that you maybe wish people would stop talking about so much?
As far as congressional reform, I was thinking more broadly about this question. I'm thinking about elections. While they're important, I think we spend entirely too much time talking about the personality of a candidate rather than the things that they're going to bring to the institution. And personally, I would love to hear about different reform ideas. I personally am a little bit of a nerd when it when it comes to war powers, and I think that's a reform that is so nebulous that I wish more people were tuned in. And then I think the thing that I wish people were talking about more, which both Greg and Jeff kind of scratched at, is that we don't have to agree on everything to move reforms forward. We can. There's this idea that if you're for this, then you can't be for that. And not everything has to be partisan. Like, we can move the institution forward for the American people without splitting it up. I'm for this, but not for that, or I'm this but not that. Like, you can still move reforms forward.
Right. And Greg, can you name a former member of Congress that you think best exemplifies what a member of Congress ought to be? Somebody that we can maybe look to as a role model.
Oh gosh, this is a hard question for me. for a few reasons. One, because I've become a bit more jaded and have trouble finding role models these days. Everybody's got their problems. But look, I also think like there's no perfect way to be a member of Congress. There have been a lot of really effective members in really different ways. The only couple of things that I would say is that a good member of Congress needs really two things. Needs to want to do the work. And the work can be different things. It can be legislating or it could be oversight. I mean, there are different roles that a congressman has they can focus on. But really do the work and be willing to compromise and work with members of the other party. And that doesn't mean necessarily being a moderate or being a centrist. There have been really effective, like I was my service on the Judiciary Committee overlapped with Ted Kennedy, for instance. Lots of things to criticize about Ted Kennedy, particularly in his personal life. But as a member of Congress, extremely effective, extremely liberal, but worked with Republicans all the time to try to move the ball in his direction, right? Like he understood that that was the job. There's really not there's anything wrong with centrists and moderates or conservatives, but just for like I think it's really important that people understand that a compromise doesn't mean wishy-washy down the middle. It doesn't. It means doing the job of legislating. And Ted Kennedy was a good example of that. Similar time on the Judiciary Committee when I was there with Senator John Kyle of Arizona, really did the work, very, very conservative. But he was at the table on immigration reform and on the last George W. Bush effort, and really had a big impact. It didn't get done, but he was willing to engage. He did co-author a massive overhaul of intellectual property law in America that, he just had this huge impact, and he wasn't famous. In fact, generally, the most famous members, the ones with the podcasts and the ones who raise the most money, are doing the job the worst, in my estimation. I think that's both true on both parties. The household names of members of Congress today tend to be the people who are not doing the job right. It's a lot of the folks who are willing to do the quiet work and willing to work with the other parties. So those two things, those were a couple of members that I interacted with, but there's not one. I don't have one model or one congressman, but.
Right. And Jeff is our panel's resident history buff. Is there any congressional leader that you think would be most effective in today's climate? And similarly, what can we learn from that person?
Yeah, so I love this question. I've thought about it a lot, and I don't really think that there's one. I think every important moment in history needs its own people to step up and solve those problems. And they can certainly learn from people in the past. Somebody like Thomas Reed, I mentioned before, he understood how to wield power, right? He understood how to navigate and organize Congress. Somebody like Tip O'Neill was willing to, work across the aisle and get things done. And I think I read it somewhere, he used to have a late drink with Ronald Reagan almost every week. And I think that type of camaraderie, that type of willingness to sit down with somebody you disagree with and have a difficult conversation is something we desperately need from our leaders right now. So, those are the two people that I thought about in Congress. Outside of Congress, I think we need somebody like a Roosevelt, either FDR or Teddy, who understood how to use the media to get things done. Right now, I don't think that Donald Trump is pretty effective at using the media to get things done, but there really isn't another politician out there that does it, and nobody's doing it in a positive way. Like I mentioned before, there's a lot of negative things getting done that way, but we need somebody who can wield power, somebody who can negotiate across the aisle, and somebody who can communicate through the media to the average citizen.
All right, we are coming up to the end of our hour, but if folks want to stick around for just a few extra minutes, we have a couple of audience questions. Gregg, I'm going to direct the first question to you, and that is that I believe that one issue this country faces is the expansion of the political parties. Since the 1970s, the executive branch has shown the danger of how primaries are handled, especially with people like Trump. Same method has been used in Congress, which has led to more extremes in terms of people being nominated. What is your stance on changes we should make to combat that? And you made reference to primaries earlier, so I'd love for you to expand on that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a great answer on this, and maybe the others can chime in. But no, I do think it's obviously a massive problem that we have this primary system where kind of the angriest and most extreme people are picking the nominees of the parties, and the incentives of members of Congress and any politician is to play to that base, particularly when we have partisan gerrymandering and most seats only um, are not truly competitive. The whole contest is in the primary. I mean, this is a huge root of our problem. And this is maybe makes me reactionary, and it's probably impossible these days. But look, I mean, I frankly do prefer a world where party bosses are picking nominees than primaries. I mean, I think the incentives of the Republican National Committee or the Democratic National Committee is to pick a candidate that can win a general election, and that we'd be better served by that than this primary system. But having a primary system, which I think is going to be hard to get rid of, we're probably better off with open primaries where there can be some crossover voters. I think it becomes more important to get rid of partisan gerrymandering, which I think is something we can accomplish. Um, and I think we ought to look at ways that we can um, break up the two-party system, which we have locked in by law in a lot of ways, and it's really hard for third parties to get off the ground. There are other systems that have first past the post, like we do, where it's not proportional representation, but they still have multiple parties. And the UK has multiple parties now, and there's parties that are strong in different regions, and we can get there if we unwind some of the laws that have helped strengthen and lock in parties and it's a big project, but I think that the primary system, coupled with partisan gerrymandering, is serving us very, very poorly.
And that tees up our next question, which says the two biggest problems that need to be discussed as one, polarization that starts at the local level due to gerrymandering and poor election systems, and two, money in politics. Christianna, I'm going to ask you to chime in on that one, since I know those are issues that issue one works on, and you also have experience at the local level.
So I'm gonna actually pull this question up as I answer it because there was a lot to it. The gerrymandering at the local level, I personally feel is less effective the more people are involved. So you could split up the vote, but a lot of times those numbers are being based off of who is voting. So at the smallest level, like what I'm saying is we're getting gerrymandered. Different states are getting gerrymandered on a very large level, but the local level is how you redirect those efforts. So if you render gerrymandering ineffective by where people are living and how people are voting, I'm not sure if that quite answers the question, but that's one fix that I might make. I also think there's an issue with how we when we do special elections at the local level, how that's being paid for, how candidates are being prepped and knowing they're going to the person in the seat is going to leave before anybody else does, so they have more time to raise the money. And I worked on some legislation once that was geared toward if you leave a seat in bad faith to do something like that, then you pay for part of that special election instead of that coming from the state. It didn't go anywhere, but it was one of the things that I thought could fix that problem. And then we are doing a lot of work on money in politics at issue one. I know that someone spoke about a ballot initiative earlier, but the ballot initiative in Maine, that was something that we followed, and we followed the oral arguments. And when states do a better job of tracking the where the money is coming from and where it's going to, and if they want to make those decisions for voting based on their knowledge, I think that it speaks for itself. If you don't want a candidate who only got in the seat because they had $10 million, and you want that boots on the ground person. I think that's something that individuals need to speak up and talk about. Not quite sure if that answers the question in the way you were looking for, Rory, but
Yeah, that does. And Jeff, we're going to let you have the last word. We would love to hear your take on those two issues, which are gerrymandering and money in politics. But also, our final question came in about proportional representation. And the question is asked by somebody who is a conservative libertarian in California and can relate to being an ideological minority, and wanted to say that a lot of advocates for proportional representation seem to identify as liberals. Is there any way to get more conservative support for that issue? What say you?
So to the proportional representation, what I would say is back to what we were talking about, a progressive reform and a conservative reform. Conservatives are typically a little hesitant to make changes to a system. They kind of, the status quo is, I mean, it's like me, I don't like to get into the water. I step in slowly, I don't jump in fast, right? And so, like, if you want to make proportional representation politically possible, I think you need to first repeal the Permanent Apportionment Act of 1929 and expand the House and bring some trust back to government, because right now people don't trust their congressperson because they don't know them. If you can expand that, you're going to take a step in the right direction. So I would say that's how you're going to get conservatives on board with that. To the point about money in politics, gerrymandering, and political parties, uncapping the House helps with all of these things, right? But prior to the 1929 Permanent Apportionment Act, the United States regularly had third parties pop up and go away. Okay, we didn't solidify party system until after the House was capped. To money in politics, the bigger the district, the more money it takes for a representative to reach voters. So if you make those districts smaller, you decrease the amount of money that they have to run it. It's the easiest way to get money out of politics, because you're not attacking the money, because if you attack the money, people with money are going to fight back with money, and that's going to make it difficult. If you go after the structural reform that de-incentivizes the money, that's a politically plausible and possible way to get forward. And then to the gerrymandering, right now, people are gerrymandering because they're afraid. They truly believe that the other party is going to take over, and we're not going to be a democracy anymore. By shifting the focus away from power and control and towards responsibility, you de-incentivize gerrymandering. Yuval Levin was on our show, and he would said something to the effect of, when you're thinking about who's going to win or the control of Congress when you're writing congressional districts, you've completely lost the point of representation. Again, we've got to get back to the responsibility of these roles and not to the power of these roles.
Thank you. We are going to leave it there because we are over time, but just wanted to say thank you again to our panelists for joining us today, and to our audience, everybody that's in attendance. This was such a good discussion, and I would encourage everybody to follow up some of those what you can do steps that were mentioned here. Please check out not only Principles First, but Issue 1, Society for the Rule of Law, and Project No Cap, all organizations here that are doing really great work. And thank you again, everybody. We hope to see you at our next virtual town hall. Principles First is doing one next week. You can see the information on their website. I encourage you all to check it out. Thank you.
thanks so much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
all.